My name is Peter Haines. I represent CCL Academy. We're here to talk about delivering regulatory training for the board. There is a Q&A board which you can access, so please do write any questions on there. I will also be around at the end to answer any questions, both on that Q&A board and also any that you wish to raise when we unmute you. You can also, of course, use the chat facility. So there are plenty of ways to ask questions. But I will be around. This is scheduled for 30 minutes, but I'm very happy to stick around at the end and to chat about anything that you wish to do to cover as far as regulatory training for the board is concerned. And you might think, why are we covering regulatory training for the board? Isn't this something that everybody does and it's fairly straightforward to organize and deliver? Well, not always is the answer to that. So, and I'll cover that as we go through the session. Please do note that this is being recorded. So we'll talk about why it's important, the challenges. We'll talk about individual versus collective training, and also think about what we need to train on. Now, I've covered two subjects here, AML and Conduct and Culture. There could be so many others: senior management responsibilities, corporate governance, bribery, fraud, other areas of financial crime, other areas of compliance. So I've just taken two subjects and just put the key messages that I would put to a board on those slides so that we can see the sort of messages that we need to get across. So why is it important and what are the challenges? Well, firstly, directors are not exempt. Everybody has to be competent to do the job for which they're employed. Directors are included in that, so board directors. And, you know, sometimes board directors, it's almost taken for granted. I sit on the board of a bank, a small UK bank, and it's my second bank directorship. And it's very interesting if you look at the different attitudes of board members to training. Some of them say, oh, I've been around in this industry for 25, 30 years. What do I need training on? And others are actually very keen to make sure that they remain up to date. So it shouldn't be taken for granted, because just because you've been in the industry for 30 years, it doesn't mean, for example, that you know the latest changes in corporate governance, the latest changes in anti-money laundering law. So if, for example, you're based in the UAE, there were new laws came in fairly recently, people need to be trained on that. If directors of the board isn't trained on that, then how can we expect everybody else in the company to be aware if the board thinks it's not that important? So, and it's not necessarily the done thing. It takes a certain amount of humility and almost courage sometimes for board members to say, actually, I don't know, I've got this gap. So it is really important for boards, individually and collectively, to be very honest with themselves and say, actually, we do need training on this area. And now we see a lot of it. We do a lot of board training. We see a lot of boards who say, yes, we do need it. But quite often, the impetus comes from the company secretary, the head of L&D, the head of compliance, sometimes individual board members or the CEO, but not always from the board itself. So I think there's a commercial imperative to make sure that the board is adequately trained. But there's also a very clear regulatory imperative. It's a very good question and frequently asked question by regulators. Okay, what is your training program and does it include the board? And often board members are excluded, not so often nowadays, but it still happens. You know, if you do an online module, board members sometimes think, oh, do I need to do this? I've done this before. I did this 2 or 3 years ago. So it's important that boards should have the humility to say, yes, I do need this as well, and to set an example to everybody else in the firm. So what are our challenges? Sometimes it can be like herding cats, as we say, trying to get trying to get board members in one place at the same time. At the moment, funnily enough, it's easier because most training, in fact, virtually all training is done virtually. So it's a lot easier to get people, board members, in one place, so to speak. They're not, of course, in one place, but in one virtual place. If it's a question of getting everybody into the same room, a physical training room or boardroom at the same time, it can be that much more challenging. But getting people, but board members in one place at the same time is still challenging, even if it's delivered virtually. Because what we often find is that board members have other board positions. They actually have, quite often they're semi-retired, so they will actually have other pastimes or maybe do voluntary work. So it can be very difficult to get everybody in one place at the same time. A typical trick, of course, is to schedule the board training right next to the board meeting, because we know that we've got everybody's attention at the same time. Now, there can be a downside to that. Do we get the board members' attention to the training? We've got to try to convince people that even though training is happening, they've actually got to listen to it and take note. But also there's a problem of fatigue. I know from my own experience that board meetings rarely last less than about 3 hours and often can go on for longer. What I often find, and I try to push back on this to a company secretary or head of compliance or CEO, often find that they'll say, I'll tell you what, let's schedule the training for after the board meeting. If the board members have been in a board meeting for 3 or 4 hours, it's a quarterly board meeting, and it is quite tiring. And if you put the training directly after that, sometimes it can be a little bit of a losing battle. So at least have a decent gap, maybe do the board meeting before lunch and the training after lunch, so people get a chance just to regather their thoughts and to get a little bit of energy, get their blood sugar levels up before you do the training. Because even though board training is usually very interesting, very challenging, the last thing you need is tired board members trying to pay attention. When board members are focused and when you can get them to devote the time to board training, the results can be quite startling, can be very, very, very positive indeed. What we tend to find is the quality of discussion is often better than you would get in any other form of training, because board members tend to be reasonably self-confident, experienced people. They know each other, they'll challenge each other. Sometimes I find myself training the board and it's more like a facilitation of a discussion. At one board training session recently, one board member was very kind. He said to me at the end, "Thank you, that was the best board training I've ever had." And I said, "Actually, I didn't do a lot of training because you were all talking amongst each other, amongst yourselves. You were challenging each other. And I was looking at the chairman, looking at my watch, saying, we're running out of time. And the chairman was saying, no, keep going. This is really good." So I just facilitated it. They did most of the discussion. So you get the quality of discussion, quality of questions. Sometimes in training sessions, even though I say there is no such thing as a stupid question in my sessions, people are slightly reticent about asking what might seem an idiot question. Board members don't have that problem. And they will ask really good questions, the questions that other people are scared to ask because they might seem like idiot questions. And those are questions often that are anything but idiot questions. They're questions that actually get you as a trainer and the board really to question their assumptions, sometimes assumptions that they have held for many, many years, and to challenge those assumptions. So the quality of the questions is really good. And of course, as board members, they have that ability and that confidence to make swift decisions. If they ask you a question and you say, well, actually, you really ought to do this, they will say, yeah, okay, let's do it. Let's do that. Let's minute that and have an action point. So the sessions, when you have them, can be really, really positive and can change behavior, which is what good training is all about. And we can talk about individual versus collective training. So individual training, where somebody's new to the regulatory environment, maybe a one-to-one session is really positive, really useful. We do a lot of that because if people have come from another region into, for example, the Middle East or to the UAE, then the regulatory environment is different. DFSA is slightly different to other regulators. DIFC is a different different animal in terms of being a free zone. If you're working for one of the banks, again, the central bank is slightly different. So different in its approach to other central banks. ESCA, we have a series of regulators in the UAE, in the Middle East. So that regulatory environment, it's important for people to understand that. People may be new to the region generally. And also you might have people who are promoted from an executive to an executive director. So they will need to understand their senior management and directors' responsibilities. And that is done very effectively on a one-to-one basis. But what about individuals who are going to be interviewed by the regulator? It's very important, I think, and we've done a lot of this over the years. I've been doing this for almost 14 years now, interviewing people, doing mock interviews before they go into the regulator for a meeting. Because if you meet with a regulator, the regulator might well, over an hour, have 30 or 40 questions. And some of those questions will be good. And the regulators often are trained on interviewing techniques. So why not get trained yourself if you're about to meet with a regulator? And you can be coached on content, on the style, on brevity. Anybody who knows me well might think that's a bit rich coming from me, but brevity of answers is really important. And openness versus honesty. What can you say to the regulator? You can't lie to the regulator, you've got to be honest, but how open should you be? And also preparation is key for meetings with the regulators. And it's amazing what people will give away through their body language. So when I interview somebody, I do a mock interview for an hour, I'll give them feedback and say, by the way, that was really great. You possibly need to be a little bit briefer in your answers. And did you realize that when you answer a difficult question, you fold your arms all the way around your chest and you give it away that this is a really difficult question? So all of those sorts of things are very useful in terms of individual training. So that's the sort of the how. Just a little bit on certain key messages. So with AML and conduct and culture, it's a good idea to refresh the board on the latest anti-money laundering initiatives and laws and rules. It's also important to look at the business risk assessment and the customer risk assessment, which is so crucial to any AML program. It's also worth reminding about suspicious transaction reporting, and also talking a little bit about the AML culture, a favorite question for regulators. What is the anti-money laundering culture within the firm? And this is a slide I typically will use when I'm talking to a board about anti-money laundering and financial crime. This is what the regulators would expect the board to do. Review the business risk assessment, review and challenge it. Make sure we've got the right procedures to mitigate risks, to manage those vulnerabilities. Of course, customer due diligence is essential as part of the AML program. It really is the first line of defense. And have you got the right person as an MLRO? Is the MLRO experienced, skilled, resourced, and very importantly, independent? Do people actually understand what they have to do, what their personal obligations are in terms of detecting, preventing, and reporting money laundering? And of course, I would say this, have you, as a board, sponsored a robust training program for all staff, including the board, of course, on money laundering and terrorist financing? So this is the program. So it's important to show the board what the program is, particularly if you look in the top right at governance. So is the right governance setting out policies, procedures, and risk, then going all the way around to say, is there the right management information coming back to the board to assure the board that the money laundering, or the anti-money laundering program, should I say, the AML program is alive and well and effective. That's a really important part of the board's responsibility. And the business risk assessment, so many will have seen this. It's important to make sure that the board is aware of this. Best practice is for the business risk assessment to be approved by the board. So have we thought about products, services, customers and markets, the geographies, jurisdictions of our clients, of our business, and the distribution channels, and all of the other key aspects of our overall business risk assessment? Have we considered that appropriately, and has the board reviewed and challenged it? And the customer risk assessment, as I said, this is the first line of defense. When a customer comes on board, you assess the risk related to that specific customer. And the whole area of CDD is so important because, of course, if you get that wrong, how do you know who your customers are? How can you understand if there's anything abnormal or potentially suspicious going through their account? And of course, high risk customers, PEPs, etc., etc. So all of this is so important for the board to understand. Nobody is exempt from the responsibility to report suspicious activities. So even the board needs to be told that, you know, if you have a suspicion, if you're concerned, you speak to the MLRO. The MLRO will then take a view independently of senior management and of the board as to whether to make a report to the criminal authorities. So that's AML, and I'm skipping through this, of course, incredibly quickly. But conduct and culture, these again are some slides that I would use typically if talking to a board. So what are the regulatory expectations as far as conduct and culture is concerned? How do we instill that positive culture? And how do we actually, as a board, show cultural leadership? How do we conduct ourselves to retain a positive culture? And what do the regulators expect? The regulators expect to see a very clear picture. I think culture, governance, and conduct are inextricably linked. So they would expect to see the cultures, the values of the firm articulated and approved by the board. They would expect to see a good, appropriate, robust governance structure in place, leading to the right decisions being made, the right conduct being evidenced in accordance with the values that we've already talked about. So those three things are inextricably linked, I think. And this is where I'm going to get slightly UK centric, because the UK regulator, which is where I come from, the UK regulator has actually done some really, really good work, I think, on conduct and culture. And they issued a paper, and I've given you a link here to it. It's DP18. It was a discussion paper issued 2 years ago on conduct and culture. And what they said is culture is accepted as a key root cause of major conduct failings that have occurred in the past. So for markets to work and firms to be successful, they need to be seen as trustworthy. So to make sense of culture, what do we mean? And they say we mean it's the habitual behaviors and mindsets that characterize an organization. Now, everybody talks about tone from the top. What is tone from the top? Is it the CEO or is it the board? I think you could argue it's the CEO overseen by the board. The CEO runs the company on a day-to-day basis, but the board will oversee the performance of the CEO and the executive. So the board really should be challenging the values and making sure that those values are espoused by the organization as a whole. And they say quite rightly, a focus on culture is the responsibility of everybody in a firm. It should be a collaborative effort by all areas and at all levels. So everybody from the top down, from the bottom up. And this is something that again, I used. This is somebody who was Chief Executive Officer of the Banking Standards Board. It's often defined culture as the way things get done when no one is looking, although actually when people are looking is also relevant. So it refers to the collective assumptions, values, beliefs, and expectations that shape how people behave in a group. And these norms will help determine what's considered admirable, tolerable, or shameful within the group. So, and what I would always do when speaking to the board is say, you as a collective group of people, you are in the best position, because the CEO would normally be on the board anyway. So collectively, the board is in the best position to shape the culture of the firm and to make clear its expectations to everybody in the firm. And as we said before, the culture, the values of the firm ideally should shape how people behave, the decisions that they make, and ensure that they make the right decisions. And what the FCA did was they looked to see what looks good in conduct risk and cultural frameworks, and they saw highly visible board and CEO sponsorship. We always talk about this idea of talking the talk and walk the walk, which is a cliche I absolutely hate. But it's all very well to say the right things, but if you don't show that cultural leadership, that cultural sponsorship, particularly in those grey areas, if there's a highly reputationally questionable deal, but it makes a lot of money, but maybe it's not the best thing for your customers, your culture, your values would say we wouldn't do this deal. We'd do it differently so that there's a right balance of risk and reward between the firm and the customers. But the lack of cultural leadership might say, do you know what? We've got this sort of information asymmetry between us and the customer. We can take advantage of that. These guys, our customers don't necessarily know what we're doing. We can probably get away with it. So the walk isn't there. So senior executive leadership in designing everything to do with conduct and culture is important, and business-led ownership. And of course, a fully integrated training, promotion, performance management, and remuneration. So the culture is there, people are trained on it, people are promoted and rewarded where the culture is shown to be healthy. So how does the board do this? How does the board show leadership? How visible and accessible are the board members? And regulators often will look at a number of different things. Accountability and leadership. Does the board make itself accountable? What are the core values? Are they properly expressed and espoused by the board and the senior executive? Are the values of the firm promoted through the business strategy, or is the business strategy simply let's make as much money as we can out of our clients? Is the remuneration strategy based not just on how much people earn for the firm, but also are we earning it in the right way? And are we rewarding people for good cultural practices as well as making money for the firm? And what we're seeing now is a lot more focus on what regulators are calling non-financial misconduct, which is behavior which isn't necessarily part of their day-to-day job. So things like bullying in the workplace, misconduct generally, sexual misconduct, those sort of things, which are regulators, and of course diversity. The regulators have started to say a lack of diversity actually shows perhaps a poor culture. So people say culture is contagious. This is a slide that I will use to boards and say, look, the tone from the top is crucial. Senior management figures have to lead by example, and one regulator, the FCA, has said conduct rules are a critical foundation for firms' culture. It's not just down to HR and compliance. Senior management are responsible. So the board ultimately has responsible for conduct in the firm. So board members are responsible for influencing conduct, making sure that people understand what good looks like in terms of conduct. So that's all I wanted to say. I notice it is actually on the half hour virtually. So just to conclude, and I will be around for questions. The responsibilities, I think, in the eyes of the regulators, are absolutely clear and very, very important. So boards need to be aware of this. So the biggest challenge is making sure the boards actually understand how important the training is, and getting the board members together at the same time and focused and not too tired. Of course, I would say this, but it's important. Do contact us if you need any support or assistance. We have been training boards for a long time. We do board evaluations. We facilitate board evaluations. We do one-to-one sessions with individual board members, both generally if they're new to the region and if they're going to be interviewed by the regulators. We will do mock interviews. So it is important. But of course, you can do this yourselves as well. So I see we've got some chat questions coming in. We will be sharing the slides. Yes, indeed. We will be sharing the slides afterwards. Any questions at all? I'm going to ask my colleague Dave, is everybody unmuted? Or ability to do it? Do people have the ability to?
They do, yeah. People can
Excellent.
unmute themselves and ask
Perfect.
questions.
So forgive me if we've overrun slightly, but does anybody have any questions? Please chat, Q&A, or just say your question.
What would be the ideal duration of a board training?
Good question, Mustafa. I think it depends on the subject. It's almost impossible, I would suggest, to do board training for more than an hour and a half to get people's not attention, but to get people's commitment in advance to that. What I often find is that board training will actually overrun simply because of the quality of the discussion, as I said earlier. So one of the important things is not to put too much in it necessarily. Always leave them wanting more, because I will often find that boards will say, oh yeah, okay, this is really interesting discussion. Can we just focus on this for a minute? And you've got 10 or 15 minutes discussion between board members on something. So they don't want necessarily always to devote half a day. They'll say, why do we have to have half a day? If you do an hour and a half, sometimes it will be it'll end up being 2 hours. I wouldn't go for any less than an hour, because I don't think you can really cover enough in that time. But we tend to say an hour and a half is about right, but it often overruns with the chairman's permission and consent because of the quality of the discussion and questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. Any other questions? I think we have something on the Q&A board. What are the UK rules around limit terms for independent directors? Play a critical role providing a fresh outside perspective, but does long service compromise independence? The UK rules say it should be 3 years and then another 3-year appointment with a maximum of 9 years. And that tends to be a pretty good, I've seen that, for example, what was it? Was it the Bahraini code or the Kuwaiti code I looked at recently? So a maximum of 9 years tends to be. The reason I went onto a board in the first place was that 2 of the independent directors had been on the board for 11 years, and the view was that they are no longer independent. They're no longer going to be challenging if they've been on the board for too long. So yes, the Qatar code is, I think it might have been the Qatar code I was looking at as well, 9 years as well, Neil. So yeah, thank you. So that tends to be the absolute maximum in good practice. It does depend, of course, because corporate governance codes tend to look at sometimes, well, they normally relate to listed companies only, and not all financial institutions are, of course, listed, but some will take listed company codes as best practice. Neil, you had another question. What about board performance assessments? How are these implemented in practice? Best practice and it's rapidly becoming good practice, is for board evaluations to be done periodically, and they will alternate between a board self-evaluation and an external evaluation. And we've done quite a lot of both. I've facilitated self-evaluations for the board, both as an external trainer and as a director. I've facilitated our own board self-evaluations twice. But we can also do external evaluations. So absolute best practice is alternate years, but some codes, and again, I think the one I looked at the Saudi code, actually, and the CMA, Saudi CMA principles recently, and they, I think, said every 3 years you should have an external evaluation. So what's important with this, I think, is to make sure that if you have an evaluation, a board evaluation, be it self-evaluation or externally facilitated, the important thing is that the findings of that, well, firstly, that the evaluation is very open and very honest, and secondly, that the findings actually are discussed properly at the board and any action points are taken forward, because a regulator might well, if they realize that you've done a board evaluation, say, show me the findings and then show me the action points and show how those action points have been implemented. Hopefully, Neil, that answers your question. Any other questions from anybody? Oh, sorry, Neil, there's one other question. Does this change anything? Are you aware of any members leaving post self-evaluation? I haven't seen that, I must admit. I can imagine how it would happen. I have seen an example of where an evaluation has actually determined that the board really didn't like the chairman, and it took about a year for the chairman to go. But the chairman was not performing satisfactorily. The good thing about board members is that they tend to be quite honest and sometimes quite brutally honest. So a good board will find that the board evaluation doesn't necessarily show anything that's desperately new. There might be different nuances to it, but board members are experienced enough and self-confident enough to say, if there's an issue, they'll say it before the evaluation comes along. And if they don't, you could argue they're not really acting as very effective board members. Any other questions? Have I missed any on the Q&A board? I don't. Neil, you say you're very skeptical about the real value of the processes. Again, I think it's down to the honesty of the process, and also if it's done externally. The problem is that quite often, if you're doing these externally, I've seen quite a few people doing external board evaluations, and the good ones will ask the tough questions and raise the tough points. The bad ones will avoid those because they're getting paid by the board to do this. And they're scared to raise the issues. A good board evaluation, both self-evaluation and externally done, will be very, very honest, because that's what the board should be doing, because the board should always be acting in the best interests of the company. And if anything needs to be improved, then it's down to the board to identify those improvements and to act on them. Are there any other questions? If there are no other questions, I see we still have quite a lot of people still on the call, which is great. I will, I'm happy to close the session, but if anybody does have any questions, I'll be on for a good few minutes yet if anybody wants to raise anything through chat or through speaking up or through the Q&A. But otherwise, thank you very much for coming along to this briefing session. Do think carefully about how your boards need to be trained and how really to get them to come to the table to be trained. And as I said before, do not hesitate to speak to us. You all know Ben Cranwell, I think, who's our client relationship manager. Don't hesitate to speak to us if we can be of help. Thank you very much for your attention and for your questions. And I wish you well and hope you all stay safe. I'm on the line if anybody still wants to raise any questions. Very good question from Namal. Do you recommend training to be different for publicly quoted companies and other small companies? I think the emphasis does change. I think for publicly quoted companies, there will in most jurisdictions be a corporate governance code that that applies primarily to listed companies. So I think in terms of corporate governance, that is a really important thing to cover. For smaller companies, which are not listed companies, as I said before, they may well be measuring themselves against best practice, and they may measure themselves against those codes, but the codes don't strictly apply to them. So it really depends on the attitude of the firm. But I would say any firm, whatever their size, you know, the cultural messages, the financial crime messages, governance messages, all of those other things, and keeping up to date are really, really important. With very, very small firms, they tend to be owner managed. So, you know, the board itself will be the people who manage the firm on a day-to-day basis. So the board isn't maybe at such a distance from the people at the sharp end doing the work. So maybe the emphasis would be different. Whereas in a larger institution, and particularly a publicly quoted institution, which is a financial services firm, you would say, okay, you know, the board is meeting every 3 months, may not be quite so visible, may not be quite so connected to the sharp end of the business. So maybe the focus would be a little bit different.